All right, I think I'll get us started as folks are trickling into the Zoom room. Good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by historian Samuel Hirst, Against the Liberal Order, the Soviet Union, Turkey, and Statist Internationalism, 1919 to 1939. And we're also very fortunate to have with us historians Eileen Kane and Steffi Marung, who will provide initial comments and launch us into our discussion this afternoon. To all of you, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and have the privilege to co-chair this seminar series with Eric Arneson of George Washington University. GW is on spring break this week, so Eric is away, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. Since 2010, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings and publications. Behind the scenes, Peter Bierstecker helps to produce the event. My thanks to him, as always. We also want to acknowledge our supporters, and we welcome your support. Details about how to support the seminar will be available in the chat right now, or simply go to our respective institutional websites. Join us on Monday next week, March 17th, for a discussion of Richard Overy's Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan. There's an exception here. This event will start at 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So a rare exception from our usual 4 o'clock starting time. Let me also thank our colleagues at the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center for co-sponsoring this event. Finally, a couple of technical notes. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of the seminar, we encourage you to use the raise hand function and put your questions, comments directly to the speakers. Once you press the raise hand function, you'll be queued, entered into a queue. Once I call on you, please unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. You can also use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then I'll put the question to our panelists. All right, with these preliminaries out of the way, let me introduce our featured speaker here today, Samuel J. Hirst. He's assistant professor in international relations department at Bilkent University in Ankara. His first book, Against the Liberal Order, the Soviet Union, Turkey, and Statist Internationalism, 1919 to 1939, came out with Oxford University Press last year. He has, right? Is this right, Sam?
Correct. Yeah.
That's correct, right? He has also published on various subjects in Russian, Turkish, and international history in journals such as Diplomatic History, Critica, and the Journal of Contemporary History. He received his BA in history from Washington University in St. Louis and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Before arriving in Ankara in 2017, he worked for 4 years at the European University in St. Petersburg, including for 2 years as chair of the history department. Sam, it's wonderful to have you here in the Washington History Seminar to launch your book. I'm excited to and looking forward to your presentation. The Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Christian, for the introduction, and thanks to Peter and everyone behind the scenes who helped to organize this event. The Washington History Seminar is a wonderful platform, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to share my work here. My only regret is that I've been fighting a cold for the past few days, and so my voice is not what it might be. I'm especially grateful to Eileen Kane and to Steffi Marung, who've taken the time to read my work and join the conversation as discussants. Eileen and Steffi, I learned from your scholarship as I was working on this project, and I look forward to hearing your sense of the connections. Against the Liberal Order, I have a copy here. It came out in the UK last summer and in the US in the fall. And although the headlines these days seem to be shifting with astonishing speed, it still seems very new to me to be able to have this conversation today. This book, my first, offers a history of interactions between the Soviet Union and Turkey in the 1920s and the 1930s. And the subtitle includes the word statism. The book is about two revolutionary elites who celebrated the power of the state. But I should admit that the statism I expected to find when I began working on this project roughly 15 years ago was not the statism about which I ended up writing. When I first conceived this project, I'd been reading historians of the Soviet Union who were writing in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and who were reevaluating the place of the Soviet experiment in 20th century history. Many of these historians wrote about the modern qualities of mass mobilization, which were given a particular tinge by the particularities of Marxist-Leninist ideology. The emphasis on modernity was, among other things, an attempt to challenge the sense of exceptionalism associated with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And in graduate school, we read works that described the Bolshevik Revolution's roots in Enlightenment thought. Distinctive the Soviet Union was, but no unicorn. In this context, it always surprised me that there wasn't more discussion of the connections between the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists. After all, if one thinks of ambitious programs of state-led modernization, then surely Lenin's and Atatürk's names are two of the first that come to mind. This is not to exaggerate my claim to originality. Especially for scholars working on Soviet Central Asia, the parallels between the Soviet Union and Turkey have long been clear. At exactly the same moment in the 1920s, elites across the two countries explored ways to replace the Arabic script in which the Turkic languages of Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia were written. But I found few works that took the Moscow-Ankara connection as their central focus, and that's what I tried to do in this book. Knowing about simultaneous language reform and simultaneous sartorial reform, I initially imagined this project as one about two interconnected stories of state-society relations. But when I got into the archives, I discovered there was an enormous gulf between, on the one hand, secularizing reforms, and on the other hand, anti-religious reforms. In other words, although the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists were aware that they were both trying to change the role of religion in their respective societies, the ideological differences between Soviet socialism and Turkish nationalism were strong enough to fuel anxiety as much as they did inspiration. When I went to the Russian archives and looked for material related to Turkey, and when I went to the Turkish archives and looked for material related to the Soviet Union, I found relatively little discussion of domestic, social, and cultural policies. Instead, what I found were piles of information about international relations, conversations between Soviet and Turkish diplomats and economists about sovereignty and international law, about foreign trade and about tariffs. And I came to recognize that there's a story here not about statism in relation to society at home, but about statism in relation to world politics and global markets. That distinction between an inward-looking and an outward-looking statism is somewhat artificial, but I do think that it helps to clarify the nature of Soviet-Turkish convergence. To give a brief overview of the subjects covered in this book, Against the Liberal Order begins in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, when the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists formed what was essentially a military alliance. Given that the Romanov and Ottoman empires had been on opposite sides during the First World War, this is quite a stunning reversal. And the impulse was unquestionably external. Just months apart, coalition forces occupied Istanbul and Odessa, Arkhangelsk and Adana, and the concurrent struggles against foreign occupation produced the first Bolshevik Kemalist rapprochement. That is, this was a military process rather than an ideological one. By 1922, as Moscow and Ankara negotiated uneasy truces with Britain, France, and their allies, the momentum in Soviet-Turkish exchange shifted to the economic sphere. By 1927, Moscow and Ankara signed a commercial treaty, and the Soviet Commissariat of Foreign Affairs heralded this agreement as its first with an Eastern country. On the basis of this commercial exchange, the Soviet and Turkish states would go on to engage in cooperative industrialization in the 1930s. Soviet engineers and economists helped the Turkish state draw up a 5-year plan. And I think we don't often appreciate that Turkey was the first foreign state to voluntarily adopt a Soviet-advised 5-year plan. As part of that plan, and with Soviet machinery, the Turkish state built 2 massive textile factories, and these would serve as prominent symbols of an early version of import substitution industrialization. As Moscow's and Ankara's cooperation reached the heights of joint factory construction, the cooperation also spread to a strikingly broad range of activities. The Soviet directors Sergei Yutkevich and Esfir Shub came to Turkey to shoot political films. Dmitry Shostakovich visited Ankara to accelerate the transition to European classical music. And Atatürk's adopted daughter, Sabiha Gökçen, became part of a group of elite students who went to the Soviet Union to study aviation. All of these exchanges were carefully coordinated and sponsored by the Soviet and Turkish states. As liberals advocated an internationalism of free trade and grassroots organization, the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists, in contrast, embraced a statist mode of international cooperation. Thus, Against the Liberal Order is as much about the international politics of the 1920s and about the 1930s as it is about the Soviet Union or Turkey. When I got around to writing the book, I was influenced by new work on liberal internationalism after the First World War. Books by Patricia Clavin, Nicholas Mulder, and others have pushed us away from a conversation about the failure of the League of Nations to secure peace and towards an appreciation of the novel ways in which Western states and international organizations sought to manage and even to weaponize an interconnected global economy. In this formative moment for liberal internationalism, that is, in the 1920s, the revolutionary Soviet and Turkish governments were the most prominent outsiders. They were outsiders in a formal sense. Both had to deal with Allied intervention, and the legacy of that conflict meant that Turkey did not join the League of Nations until 1932. The Soviet Union did not join the League of Nations until 1934. But in addition to remaining outsiders to the most prominent international organization of the era, they were also outsiders to the new economic processes whose importance we are now more fully recognizing. The Bolsheviks, of course, had early experience of sanctions and economic blockade. But in 1925, Turkey also faced the prospect of sanctions when Ankara and London were struggling for control of the oil-rich city of Mosul. More broadly, as an exclusive club of central bankers worked to reestablish the gold standard in the 1920s, the Soviet and Turkish governments were largely excluded from international conversations about finance and lending. The history of these excluded states offers us a new perspective on the interwar era. That era, in some ways like ours today, seems one of early liberal triumph followed by nationalist backlash. We might think of a novel, albeit a weak order emerging from the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. And then, to use a word that Adam Tooze uses in The Deluge, we think about an insurgency in the 1930s, a nationalist insurgency led by Japan, Germany, and Italy. The interesting thing about this chronology is that the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists don't fit. They were, as it were, neither fish nor fowl. In the 1920s, when the League threatened to be a dominant force in international relations, they remained outside. In the 1930s, when the League stood in opposition to the rising insurgents, the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists joined the League. Recognizing Soviet-Turkish cooperation in the 1920s as a form of internationalism, helps us to think beyond binaries of peace and war, order and chaos, internationalism and nationalism. The Bolsheviks and the Kemalists arrived at an internationalism at odds with the dominant liberal paradigm, an internationalism that was statist, but was not insurrectionary. And I should add here the caveat that Moscow housed a communist international and plenty of Bolsheviks worked for world revolution. But in Turkey, the Comintern's influence was strictly limited, and it was much more the commissariats of foreign trade and foreign affairs that were the key players. If there was one shared assumption that was relatively consistent in Soviet-Turkish encounters, it was the idea of underdevelopment. Steffi Marung has written about this concept in her own work on Soviet-African relations in the second half of the 20th century, and is a familiar idea in the Cold War context. In the 1950s, the Soviet government would claim that relations with the Third World benefited from a shared experience of backwardness. In Central Asia, the argument went the Soviet Union had developed practices that were relevant abroad. And there was a similar sense in Soviet-Turkish relations of a shared experience of late development. But what was interesting about the Soviet-Turkish case was that many prominent Bolsheviks looked at Turkey and saw something of their own predicament. Unlike in the 1950s, in the 1920s in Moscow, it was quite common to talk about the danger of the Soviet Union becoming dependent upon Western finance. And in Ankara, there was interest in Moscow's experience industrializing without falling into long-term debt traps. That is, there's a basic similarity in the place of the Soviet Union and Turkey in the international system. This shared fear of the political implications of Western economic power was part of what allowed for a Soviet-Turkish statism. On the subject of the liberal foil, I should say that in both Ankara and Moscow, it was quite common to find claims that the slogans of liberal internationalism were nothing but a facade. Both the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists saw the world in terms of an international hierarchy, and they believed that the status quo favored the established powers. For two countries that had been invaded by Western armies, there was a conviction that the myths of free markets and private enterprise relied on the power of guns, or more importantly, gunboats. We might note that both the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists relocated their capitals inland, away from the more exposed Petrograd and Istanbul. If there was an ideological core to the shared statism in the Soviet Union and Turkey, then it rested in a sense that in the conditions of global capitalism that obtained, coordinated state action was necessary to reduce the distance between advanced industrial powers and less developed agricultural Eurasian heartlands. But I emphasize there the word if, because against the liberal order, this book is a story of learning processes. The Bolsheviks used the language of anti-imperialism early, but this language brought limited success in Turkey. The Bolsheviks' representatives abroad realized that they could channel old tools of empire for new purposes, and they often behaved in ways that reminded Turks of Tsarist forebears. Eileen Kane has written about the ways that the Russian Empire used the infrastructure of the Hajj to project power beyond its borders. And she has shown that the Bolshevik Revolution did not bring a distinct ideological break with the past. The same was true for Soviet diplomats and trade representatives in Turkey. Nevertheless, interactions with the Kemalists gradually forced Soviet foreign policy to change in important ways. At the beginning of this period, the Bolsheviks had a class-based vision of internationalism, one that didn't allow much space for the notion of state sovereignty. But in Ankara, sovereignty was part of Kemalist orthodoxy, and in various ways, the Kemalists pushed their Soviet counterparts to appreciate the role that sovereignty played as a tool of resistance. The Kemalists had success because they could point to the ways that Western internationalism sought to protect commerce and capital from states. By the 1930s, at least in Turkey, Soviet diplomats and economists had evolved to embrace a vision of state-sponsored and state-managed exchange. 20 minutes for these opening remarks don't leave me much time to delve into details, and it's easier to describe the broad interventions as I've been doing here. But briefly, I'd like to just mention some of the archival evidence I found, which speaks to many other learning processes. In response to the multilateralism of the League of Nations, the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists embraced bilateralism. And as unglamorous as a Soviet-Turkish neutrality pact in 1925 might sound to our ears today, the Soviet government heralded this neutrality as a breakthrough the breakthrough that post-war World War diplomacy had been waiting for. In foreign trade, the Soviet and Turkish governments arrived at an early version of clearing agreements in 1927. And when the Turkish foreign minister proposed what was then a technical novelty in trade, what he referred to as a net balance, the Soviet ambassador asked where the idea was coming from. The Turkish foreign minister responded that it was a natural response to the exploitative nature of Western trade patterns, to predatory trade deficits. On questions of geography, Soviet and Turkish elites developed a shared distrust of maritime ports like Istanbul and Izmir because these were signs of Western commercial power. The Bolsheviks and the Kemalists agreed too about ethnic minorities. They assumed that these minorities would be less likely to work for national development and more likely to collaborate with Western corporations. One of my more striking archival finds was that Soviet trade organizations sought to trade with ethnic Turks rather than Jews or Greeks or Armenians. And this was not merely a concession to the Kemalists. It fit in with a Soviet worldview that increasingly tended to see the world in terms of a desired territorialization of ethnicity and of centralized states. By the 1930s, there could be little surprise that one of the two factories that was built in the heart of Anatolia, in the landlocked city of Kayseri. To conclude my initial comments here, I'd like to tie back to a couple of points that I made at the beginning. The factories built in Turkey with Soviet machinery and technical advice looked something like Soviet industrial projects in Egypt and India in the 1950s. During that later period, when the Cold War seemed to present a binary choice between communism and capitalism, there was a tendency, and I still think there's quite a bit of this today, a tendency to think in terms of a Soviet export of a distinctive model of state-society relations. But in Turkey in the 1930s, I see little evidence that the Kemalists were interested in a Soviet model, per se. Techniques, yes, but model, no. Turkey's five-year plan, though influenced by Soviet advisors, was radically different than its Soviet analog. At one point, the Turkish government briefly considered whether the textile produced by these two new factories should be sold in state-owned stores. But the immediate and overwhelming consensus in Ankara was that distribution was a problem for private enterprise. Nevertheless, just because the Kemalists were not interested in a Soviet model of development, I don't think our conclusion should be that this cooperation was merely pragmatic. Or in place of pragmatic, I might use the word transactional. It's a word that's being bandied about a lot these days. The list of innovations I just reeled off attests to the way that this statist cooperation privileged particular groups, it privileged particular geographies, and it privileged particular forms of exchange. Even if Soviet machinery did not represent an alternative to the existing international order, for both the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists, statist internationalism seemed to be an alternative to existing modes of international cooperation. Thanks, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sam. Wonderful. It is now really my great pleasure to introduce our first commentator, Professor Eileen Kane, Professor of History at Connecticut College. Eileen is an historian of modern Europe with a research focus on the relationship between Russia and the Middle East. As an undergraduate, she spent, as she writes in her biography, a life-changing year studying in Moscow in 1991-92, the year the USSR, of course, was dissolved, living in the dorms of Moscow State University with students from across the socialist world and the Soviet Union. She became aware of the many different ethnic and religious groups that had lived under Tsarist and then Soviet rule, and yet were barely mentioned in her history classes in the US. Her interest in the non-Russian peoples of the USSR carried after her carried her after college to Istanbul, Turkey, where she spent 2 years, 1995, 1997, on a Fulbright scholarship, learning Turkish and studying migrations from the Caucasus to Anatolia. She received her PhD in history from Princeton in 2005. Dr. Kane is the author of Russian Hajj, Empire and Pilgrimage to Mecca, published by Cornell in 2015, winner of the Marshall Shulman Prize from the Association of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Her latest book, Russian Arab Worlds, a documentary history, published by Oxford in 2023, continues the work of integrating Russian and Middle East history. It's wonderful to have you with us. Eileen, the Zoom room is yours. There you go.
Thank you for that nice introduction and for the kind invitation to participate in this wonderful event. Sam Hirst has written a marvelous book that makes correctives to our knowledge about the interwar period and the political and economic partnerships that were formed in reaction to liberal internationalism after World War I. Against the Liberal Order begins with an introduction dense with insights and provocative statements. And I mean dense in the very best sense here as like nutritious, filled with good substance that fuels something, in this case, knowledge. And I am perhaps thinking in terms of food metaphors because Sam also starts the book and ends the book with figs and fig trees, which if you've ever been to Turkey, you know are abundant. And they're absolutely delicious. So I really like this about the book, Sam. Against the Liberal Order is one of the best boundary-defying histories I've read in a long time. We in the American Academy are still saddled with the categories that were invented after World War II that divide up the world. And these artificially separate the history of the Soviet Union from the history of the Republic of Turkey. And they also reinforce myths that continue to structure how we see the world in terms of East versus West, Muslim versus Christian, and communist versus capitalist. The reality, of course, was not so neat. And these divisions that we live with still today, since the end of World War II, when we project these back into the interwar period, they have concealed a lot for a long time. So Sam discusses this briefly and very nicely in his introduction. And this is one of the most successful books, to my mind, in genuinely, if not crossing, destroying these boundaries and making the case for a sort of seamless story that connects these two parts of the world. And that is important beyond just the book itself, but what it contributes to efforts to break down these boundaries. Against the Liberal Order can be read in a number of ways. It will for sure be grouped on grad school reading lists along with other studies of international politics and early Soviet and Turkish foreign policy, and I hope with other new revisionist histories of the interwar period in the former Russian and Ottoman empires. I was thinking of some of these books as I was reading Sam's book over the last few days, and they include Masha Kirasirova's excellent new book, The Eastern International, of course, and perhaps less obviously, new work by Elisa Ben-Porad and Jeffrey Weidlinger on the catastrophic pogroms that took place during and after World War I in the former Russian imperial lands, and that had long been eclipsed. Both authors discussed this in their introductions. Why was this history forgotten for so long? Well, they had been eclipsed in terms of capturing historians' attention by the much more catastrophic Holocaust that took place during World War II. So I really see this book as joining a growing collection of histories that are pushing us to not only revise a lot of what we think or thought we knew about the interwar period, but also to question the categories that we've been living with for so long and the assumptions. And Sam talks a lot about assumptions and then deflates them, skewers them in his book. So, and, connections also and exchanges across the Black Sea, which there are other parallel events that we could discuss later that do not seem coincidental, and they're almost never, the two genocides, for instance, across the Black Sea. That's almost, the pogroms are never discussed in relation to, or in the same framework with the genocide in Anatolia that took place before and during World War I. So I would like to ask a couple questions. I had many, but I want to just ask a few so that I, give others a chance to ask questions. I'm sure many people will want to. The first one on page 17, and this is on the digital version of the book, you make a remarkable statement about how the Soviet-Turkish partnership, how the Soviets saw the Turks as familiar people. They recognized them. These are people, this is me editorializing a little, but these are people we can work with. And you say because of geography, and geography is a big part of your argument, which I found really interesting and completely compelling. And also ethnicity and culture, you say because they were Asian, Eastern, semi-colonial, and underdeveloped. So they see this in one another, and this makes them feel familiar to, or I think in this particular sentence, you're saying the Soviets see this in the Turks and they find this familiar. So I'm wondering, where is Islam and Muslims in this story? Like, does it matter to the people that you're looking at? Perhaps it doesn't. Does it matter that the Russian-dominated Soviet government is dealing with a Muslim majority country, albeit a secular one? What has happened to Russians' Orientalist stereotypes about Turks, and do these shape this partnership in any ways that you saw? My second question.
Why don't we give Sam a
Oh,
chance to respond? Yes, we can go a little back and forth. Thank you, Eileen. Sam.
Well, first, Eileen, thank you very much for the very kind comments about my book. I have not yet seen a review, and so it's very rewarding to hear such praise. And you're absolutely right that I was trying to challenge borders, boundaries, categories, and the way that I think we too often assume that this division between the Soviet Union and the Middle East really predates the emergence of the category of the Middle East during the Cold War. And yes, I was trying to argue that in the aftermath of the First World War, there was a lot that tied these two states together. On the question of geography, and I assume that most people in the audience here haven't read the book, and so I'll flesh out that story about the figs. Anyone who's been to Turkey will recognize the importance of figs, but I think anyone who's been to Trader Joe's in the United States will also recognize that this is one of Turkey's prime exports. And in terms of the global economy, figs are one of Turkey's remarkable comparative advantages. The Menderes River Valley on the Western Aegean is one of the it is probably the best place in the world for fig trees to grow. And what struck me as remarkable when I drove through that valley one August, and I've been living in Turkey for over a decade total, and the sense of geography that comes through in the book is really a product of me sort of sitting on this material for a long time and thinking about the geographic connections. And I remember long after I'd been working on this book and long after I'd been thinking about these two factories that were built in Nazilli and Kayseri, I remember driving through the Menderes Valley in late August and the figs everywhere. And it was just remarkable to me that Soviet economists and Turkish bureaucrats would choose to build a factory there. Because labor was very, very hard to find because everybody could collect figs from the nearby trees, and the Nazilli factory really struggled to draw labor after it was established. And when I say that the passage that you describe on page 17, this recognition of familiarity, the recognition of familiarity was really in the sense of the global economy. The sense of an agricultural society that had done extremely well exporting tobacco and dried fruits. The Russian equivalent would be exporting grain and then oil. And the categories that Soviet representatives in Turkey used, Asian was a word that they used, Eastern was a word that they used. I see these as relatively unreflective. There's not a lot of thought being put into these categories. And the real sense of similarity comes from an understanding of economies and the place of these economies in an international system. And you ask a very important question: where is Islam? And at some point, I realized that it's really remarkable that the Soviet Union never sent, as an ambassador to Turkey, a Muslim or the son of a Muslim, to draw on one of Masha Kirasyrova's phrases. That is, in the 1920s, I found explicit discussion of this question. When Georgy Chicherin in the Soviet Commissariat of Foreign Affairs is arguing with Stalin about who to send to Ankara, he wants to send Maxim Litvinov, who would go on to become another Commissar of Foreign Affairs. And Chicherin made the argument that the Turks were a martial group, that not all Turks, but the Kemalists, that these were military men. They respected power, they respected strong states, and they needed someone, he said, from the center. There was a strong sense that Turkey's aspiration to be European was something that the Soviets would meet by treating it as a European partner in diplomatic affairs. And one of the ways was doing this was downplaying ethnic or religious connections across borders. So the question of where is Islam, I would say the short answer is that it was explicitly downplayed by two states that saw a convergence in international terms, that in terms of geography and economy, rather than in terms of ethnicity and religion.
Great. Eileen?
That's totally fascinating, and also persuasive and compelling. I can think of, including in this latest book that Masha Kirasirova and Margaret Litvin and I co-edited, of using the nationalities, like using Armenians to send as cultural workers or diplomats to Lebanon to speak with Lebanese Armenians. And so I kind of got this idea in my head that this was that you sort of capitalize on these different nationalities and send them, or religious groups, and that is a totally fascinating case that you describe. Can I ask my second question?
Sure, go ahead, please.
This one is about how far back you would go to find the roots of the Soviet-Turkish partnership. And I'm thinking much of the scholarship on the, say, Soviet Union and the Arab world was until recently by political scientists, so less perhaps historically minded. But if you were to read that, you would think that this just came out of thin air, these connections between the Soviet Union and the Arab world, partnerships. So I'm wondering where you would locate the beginnings of this. And I'm thinking here of the Turkic-speaking emigres who were leaving the Russian Empire. This is actually the reason I became interested in this, and that's why I went to Turkey in the first place in the 90s, but then moved away to other subjects. But mostly intellectuals, or not mostly, but there was an important group of intellectuals, emigres from Russian and later Soviet lands, who moved to the Ottoman Empire, which then became Turkey, and they were central to the nation. I know you know this history, Sam, nation building processes. 5 of the 14 leading members of the Young Turk movement were born in Russia. I learned from one of these sources. So I'm wondering, like, where do you see the beginnings? Is there a beginning in these important intellectuals, important in the sense that they'll play a big role in, even movements that didn't succeed? Like I'm thinking of Zeki Velidi Togan, Pan-Turkism, of course, didn't succeed, but he was kind of a big deal for a while. So where would you find the roots of this? How far back would you go?
Thank you for another great question. And when I live in Ankara, and I regularly get called in by diplomats, especially European Union diplomats, to ask about Russian-Turkish partnership convergence in recent years. And in a lot of the conversations, and if you read sort of current journalism, a lot of the sort of news articles begin with this sense of centuries-long Russo-Ottoman rivalry. And you ask sort of where does, I talk about partnership and convergence, and where does this come from? And certainly, so Mike Reynolds in Shattering Empires has written about this a bit, and he points to the fact that in the beginning of the 19th century, the late 1820s, 1830s, you get a moment of Russo-Ottoman cooperation against foreign and including Western threats. And he points to a moment on the eve of the First World War, before the Russian and Ottoman empires were drawn into the war on different sides, when you see the establishment of a Russo-Ottoman cooperation union in Istanbul. It's in 1914. And the idea of sort of centuries-long rivalry, I think, is that it has, like all narratives, it has some truth to it. There were something like 17 wars fought between the Russian and Ottoman empires in the space of a couple of centuries. But I think that you really see a significant change in the late 19th century. And this has to do with one of the ideas that I referred to in my opening comments, and it's a fear of foreign debt. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Russian and the Ottoman empires become the states, the imperial states, become two of the most indebted governments in the world. And the revolutionaries become increasingly, whether in the Russian Empire or in the Ottoman Empire, increasingly worry that the Tsarist or the Ottoman state is going to be beholden to Western finance. And you get this critique of the power of Western capital and the dependence of Russian Ottoman states. And in that recognition of sort of a geopolitical economic similarity, I think you get the roots of what I'm interested in. And I would say that the key example would be Alexander Helpand, Parvus Effendi, who was famous for helping bring German gold to the Bolsheviks for the revolution. He spent years in Istanbul on the eve of the First World War, and he wrote extensively from a sort of pseudo semi-Marxist perspective on the Ottoman economy. And he made the argument that there were significant similarities and to the place of the Ottoman imperial economy in the world's system. It's an anachronistic phrase. But in terms of thinking about the world economy as center and periphery, there was an increasing argument that the Ottoman Empire was a semi-colony. It was politically independent, but it sacrificed economic independence. This was an argument that Lenin would make famous. When Lenin talked about semi-colonies, his key examples were Turkey, Iran, and China. But I think the roots of what I'm interested in are in that sense of a similar position for the Russian and Ottoman societies, economies in a global economic system.
Thank you. Maybe we'll bring our second commentator into the conversation. Arlene, there's probably room for another question later on if you have any further questions. But I'm really delighted to welcome to the Washington History Seminar Dr. Steffi Marong, who has been patiently waiting as the clock ticks towards a very late hour in Leipzig. Dr. Marong is the director of the Global and European Studies Institute at Leipzig University and the principal investigator of free radicals, political mobilities, and post-colonial processes of re-spatialization in the second half of the 20th century. Those German research project titles. Wow, at the Collaborative Research Center at the University of Leipzig. Specializing on global connections of Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th century, she teaches global history in Leipzig and Addis Ababa University. Holding a PhD in global studies from Leipzig University, she studied political science and German literature in Halle, Berlin, Prague. Currently, her research addresses more broadly socialist mobilities of activists and experts from Eastern Europe and the global South during the 20th century. Absolutely fascinating subject, I have to say, as well as debates on international development with a focus on the agrarian question, while she works on a book project investigating Soviet African studies during the Cold War, another great project. Dr. Marong, welcome. Zoom room is all yours.
Thanks a lot for the invitation and this very kind introduction. Thanks a lot, Sam, for giving me the opportunity to read the book so freshly out of the press. It's hard to add more enthusiasm to Aline's comment at the beginning, which I fully share. I will engage a little bit with the book against my déformation professionnelle, so with the look at the 20th century, but also with an interest in global histories of international development, but also with, of course, an eye on Soviet-African relations. And as you know, Sam, I also learned a lot from your work since the previous years. So therefore, that is a little bit the framework of me sharing a little bit the reading of the book. So maybe for the audience that hasn't read the book, Against the Liberal Order is not a book about the present, even though it could be. It could be more of a comment on present dynamics that we witness every time we open the news today. But that's one of the reasons that I read the book with a big pleasure, but also with a great despair, getting into that in that connection. But the book rather draws us back into the two turbulent decades of the interwar, as Sam explained earlier on, that provided a fertile ground for what Sam calls statist internationalism. So in that regard, it's not only defining an against of the liberal order, but very much engaging with a productive counter-proposal to the international order, which is not only to be branded as illiberal, but very productive as a novel form of internationalism. And while you claim at the very end of the book that the Soviet-Turkish internationalism that you analyze fits poorly with our sense of the 20th century, which probably is right, one could argue that it probably is a very productive lens to understand the 21st century in many respects. So in that regard, even though if there might be people that are not fans of the interwar period, which is a wonderful period to study, but more look into present dynamics, I can highly recommend the book to learn from. What I find particularly interesting about your approach is that you bring together, and I agree very much with Eileen that it really is a very productive proposal to rethink categories and boundaries of disciplines and also of assumptions that 20th century historiography has been engaging with. And I think why you are so successful in doing that is that you engage with a triangle of three interconnected processes that are rarely brought together that systematically as you do. And that is, firstly, I would say the re-territorialization or the re-spatialization of empires, both the Soviet and the Ottoman Empire, which included attempts of remaking Eurasian space, establishing regional economic and political orders, rethinking geographical categories such as the East, Vostok, which is a highly productive field to study for thinking about these re-spatializations of empire, but also the remaking of border regimes that you're addressing, as well as the remaking of mobilities of goods and people. So this whole process of remaking empire in the region is one pillar of that triangle. The second one that has a lot to do with it, of course, are the attempts to reconfigure the international order after the First World War, which again combines a multitude of attempts. So to escape what you call the Paris Order, I would call the global condition of the early 20th century. So the Western globalization project that combines graded sovereignties, graded civilizational levels, so to say, with a universalist language of interconnectedness and liberalism. So this counter-reaction to this Paris Order as an attempt to remake the international rules of the game for the new kind of revolutionary democracies. But also, I would include into that the remaking of knowledge orders. So all the aspects that address area studies in your book, of course, were of huge interest for me as well. And thirdly, the third pillar or third node of that triangle that you bring in is the emergence of new visions for national development that included efforts to redefine trade, international economic relations, but very much then moved from rethinking trade into rethinking socioeconomic restructuring by pushing for industrialization, by building factories not simply as an instrument for industrialization, but as a broader instrument for remaking socioeconomic conditions. So in that regard, you do not only zoom into the roots or origins of this very particular geography of interconnections, but very much also into the roots of what then would become later international development as first two national projects that become interconnected. So it's this triangle that you systematically bring into conversation throughout the book, which I really found very convincing and fascinating. And I would argue that this is a triangle that is the breeding ground. You call it different internationalisms. I would maybe conceptualize this as competing globalization projects. So what we really learn from your book is that in addition to what we already have seen with Glenda Sluga's book on the dialectical relationship between nationalism and internationalism, what you very well, I think, show is that the counter-reaction to liberal internationalism does not equal the cutting of interconnectivity, but rather is a different version of how to shape and how to structure this interconnectivity to define who's profiting from it, where is the center and the periphery of these interconnected relations. So very much reminding us of the debates we are confronted with today, where new actors appear on world stage, who also come in with new claims about where is the center and where is the periphery of global interconnectedness, who is to profit and who's to be excluded. So in this typology of competing internationalisms or globalization projects, about which we have learned a lot since the last decades with the inclusion of socialist and fascist internationalisms, but also green internationalisms, anti-colonial internationalisms, etc. So there's a lot of literature that really has helped us to go beyond these universalist claims of liberal internationalism. I think you really have a promising candidate in this typology that is hard to digest because it indeed cannot be easily subsumed in one ideological category or one geographical category or one social category or a cultural category, but it really crisscrosses both ideological and geographical categories as we knew it. And in this regard, I think it's very helpful also to think about current problematics. And the internationalism that you are talking about is this bringing together of two peripheral states that very much were sharing this sense of being marginalized in the global economy, but also a sense of anti-Westernism, which I think is another crucial element in your story that is so important for us also to reflect upon today. This anti-Westernism drives this very productive emergence of this statist internationalism that you describe. What I also very much liked about your argument is that you go beyond this also very conventional narrative of let's check how successful this encounter was and this relation was. Let's count the trade volume. Let's measure the impact on the gross domestic product. And then at the end of the day, we come to the conclusion that the Soviet Union unfortunately lacked the resources to really have an impact in these terms, or that Turkey did not flourish as was planned initially. But rather, what you very well demonstrate is that the impact or the success of the story lies very much in the transformation of the repertoire in terms of a language in which actors, contemporaries at the time could talk about an international order, could talk about alliances, but also in terms of new strategies to think about modernity beyond the Western script. In that regard, I think this going beyond this success obsession is also very helpful, not only to think about the interwar period, but particularly also to think about the Cold War, where this kind of measuring of success of who was more influential, who was more impactful in this dichotomy is very much inspirational. A final aspect maybe that I would like to highlight, what I also liked very much about the book, is that you show how intertwined those ways out of empire were for the Ottoman and the Russian Empire, leading into what then became new spatial configurations with the Soviet Union and the Turkish Republic, I would argue. And I think in this regard, you also add to the debate, this long-lasting debate about was the Soviet Union empire or not. I think it's more important, as you do, to highlight how this combination of the legacies of this empire, the inherited infrastructures and resources, but also the inherited ways of thinking were combined with the attempts to profoundly remake this order and this kind of synchronicity of the colonial and the post-colonial, the imperial and the post-imperial, how this has shaped Soviet history throughout is very important to think about the newness of what then has emerged, going beyond established categories that we know from the 19th century, such as empire. And again, I would argue that this very much highlights the relevance of this book also for present discussions, where we're also looking for new categories to describe what do we actually see emerging. Is the empire coming back? Is the Cold War coming back? I would argue we need new categories for that. And in this regard, I think your book offers a number of inspirations to push this forward. Now, I also have a whole list of questions, and I will try to focus a little bit. Actually, I wanted to start with, because when I was reading the book, as I said at the beginning, I was, of course, very much also thinking about the present, and I was wondering, how is it to write such a book in the very moment that the world that you're writing about is actually falling apart? So I was wondering how, 22, 24, 25 has impacted. I mean, obviously the book has been with a publisher the last months, I know, which probably was also good. But I was wondering how the present transformation has impacted writing this book and impacted your argument.
Well, first, let me say thank you for that reading of my book. It's a real pleasure to hear it read in ways and sort of described in ways that I could not myself. Your description of that triangle is not one that I use in the book, and it's not one that I think I could have come to easily. I began this project feeling like a very parochial historian, and I worked hard reading about the League of Nations and liberal internationalism to figure out sort of how to break out of the boundaries of Soviet and Turkish history. But when you describe globalization projects, I feel myself a parochial historian again, because this is not a term that I use, but it is absolutely a description of what I am trying to do in the book. I repeatedly came across the argument that after the First World War, borders went up between the Soviet Union and Turkey, or perhaps in the 1920s there was exchange, but then the borders went up in 1928, 29. And it was never satisfying to me because I could see that there were hundreds of Turkish students going to study in Moscow in the 1930s. And there were new forms of mobility being maybe smaller in number, maybe more state controlled, but new forms of mobility were being opened up. And so your description of this as a globalization project, I think, is absolutely one that I would concur with, even if I don't use the phrase in the book. In terms of what it's been like to write this or talk about this as the world that I'm describing has fallen apart, I would say that thankfully I stopped writing this before Trump won a second term. I stopped writing this before sorry, let me stop. Right now, I have a much clearer and firmer sense that that world is falling apart. When I was finishing up the book, I had questions, but the horizon was much more open-ended for me. 2022 definitely was, it was so personally a very difficult moment for me in many ways. But when the Russian government sought to court the Global South, as it's now called, I could say this kind of looks like what I'm describing. When the Turkish government didn't quite get on board with a lot of the European sanctions, I could say this kind of looks like the neutrality that I'm interested in the interwar period. So 2002 was a real moment of searching for me, but it was not yet as clear to me that the liberal internationalism that I write about as being sort of so powerful, at least in the minds of Bolsheviks in Moscow and Kemalists in Ankara in the 1920s and 1930s, that shift wasn't as clear as it is to me today. So I struggle more now to talk about it than I did when I was writing. When I was writing, it still seemed that the liberal internationalism had a lot of, and to be honest, Western sanctions still carry a lot of power.
Thank you. Steffi, do you want to take?
May I go on?
Sure, please.
Thanks, Samuel. I mean, it's particularly this also this anti-Westernism, the role of how Western categories are read in a world or in a part of the world that does not perceive itself as part of the West that outspokenly, that I think indeed is very an important driver of the present debate. And we could probably go on how much this is kind of a re-emergence of an old pattern, or in how much this is a reconfiguration in a new form. But I have a more specific question that also connects to one of my own research interests, and that's the agrarian question, the role of agriculture and agrarian modernity in your story. So while you focus on state-led development that focused on industrialization, the countryside, of course, is the crucial baseline also in your story. However, it's not systematically developed what exactly the relationship between the transformation of the countryside or the fantasies of the transformation of the countryside, rural populations, rural economies, were to these fascinating industrialization projects. I mean, you hinted at this at the beginning that you were wondering why were they building this factory in this wonderfully productive agricultural area. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about what you found in the archives, how your elites that you're looking at were thinking about the countryside, what would happen to these populations and these logics of social and also cultural dynamics once industrialization was that successful.
So in terms of archival findings, one of the things that surprised me was that in the 1920s, the Soviet Union was pushing Turkey to take more development-oriented Soviet exports. There's a remarkable set of letters from as early as 1921 when Georgy Chicherin was corresponding with Stalin and saying that if we really want to help Turkey in its anti-imperialist struggle against the West, we should take some underutilized factories from Soviet Russia, this is even before the Soviet Union had been established, and ship them to Turkey. And Stalin says, no, this is he says, this is the music of the future, to quote him directly. This is maybe something that we can imagine at some later point in time, but the 1920s was too early. And so there was a sense that trade was not just about the international division of labor, but that it could be oriented towards development goals in the 1920s. But that sense of a more directed set of exchanges, it doesn't really sort of come to the fore until the early 1930s. And one of the things that struck me was that as late as 1931, when the Turkish government is beginning to think about asking for export credits from the Soviet Union, it's not yet clear what the exports will look like. And prominent figures in the Soviet government, Lev Karahan in particular, writes to Stalin and proposes that it could either be tractors or it could be textile machinery. And when he's proposing tractors, he's thinking about increasing Turkey's agricultural exports, allowing Turkey to later buy industrial machinery on its own terms. It's not agriculture or industry, but the Soviet government, certainly as late as 1931, was thinking about aid to Turkish agriculture. The Turkish government was much more set on replacing expensive imports, and it was the Turkish government who was pushing for textile machinery. So in that sense, quite late, I don't think you see a strong or a sole preference for industry. But on the other hand, certainly on the Soviet side, there was a reading of Turkish nationalism that really favored industrial development. And this was part of a broader story that I tell in the book. In the late 1920s, after Chiang Kai-shek in China turns on the Chinese communists, it becomes increasingly difficult for the Soviet Union to argue that relationships with a nationalist bourgeois state like Turkey is something progressive in world historical terms. And you see increasingly radical calls from especially younger revolutionaries in the Soviet Union who argue that the Soviet state should throw its support behind Turkish workers and peasants. And it becomes a problem for the Soviet Union. How do you justify cooperating with a state that is putting communists in jail? How do you justify cooperating with a state that is quite clearly a tool of the nationalist bourgeoisie? And I talk about statism, but of course, for the Bolsheviks, the state was never an entity in itself. It was an expression of class interests. In the Turkish case, it was an expression of the national bourgeoisie. And so how do you articulate, justify defense for this? Well, this comes back to some of my opening comments about a Soviet reading of Turkey as a fractured country, where you have sort of an agricultural coastline, compradors, a port bourgeoisie. These were words that they would frequently use to describe export-oriented agriculture. This was a bourgeoisie that was affiliated or associated with the West, and clearly not something with which the Soviet Union wanted to be associated. But an industry-oriented bourgeoisie, this, especially if you're hoping for the emergence of a proletariat in Turkey, this could be sort of a world historical progressive role. And so I think that while the interwar period is one in which there was no Soviet model of development to be exported, There was no clear preference for industry. The possibility of sending tractors to Turkey was still very, very possible as Soviet elites thought about what cooperation with Turkey would look like. But in ideological terms, you can also see why there was an increasing preference for industry. And it had to do with, a somewhat opportunistic reason for how do you justify working with a national bourgeoisie in Turkey? I mean, you asked, I'm not quite answering your question because you asked how do these sort of agricultural masses, which clearly exist around the islands of industry, how do they fit into this vision? And I would say that, it's certainly for the factories in Kayseri and Nazilli, both on the Soviet side and the Turkish side, there's a real vision of these places as social spaces of transformation. The labor itself was supposed to be transformative, but they also had cinemas and they had sports teams, and the agricultural laborers from the surrounding countryside there's evidence of this, were actually brought in to see cinemas, were brought in to watch the sporting events. And sporting events was, of course, about disciplining the body and new regimes of time and discipline, etc. So while the industry was limited in its scope, it was seen as sort of dragging the agricultural countryside along with it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Steffi, do you want to go for
just as a
question?
comment, sorry,
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
as a comment back, but there are many questions also in the chat. That very much resonates with debates I've been following around this mnogoukladnost, this multi-structurality, that was also discussed at the Comintern in the late 1920s. So this idea that Russia has been structured around different kind of pockets of revolutionary potential, the proletarian centers, while there was a backward agricultural hinterland that would also be dragged by this revolutionary proletariat into revolution. And that was a scheme that then was translated into this debates about the non-capitalist path of development that then Lenin later on under Khrushchev came back. And I was wondering if that also played a role for debates about Turkey. So this idea of there are multi-structural economies and we can deal with these particular pockets where there is revolutionary potential, while we have to drag the rest of the country into that dynamic. But that's maybe also something we can continue in another conversation to give room to the questions in the chat as well.
All right. Well, let me encourage first of all, thank you, Dr. Mara. But let me encourage our audience to join the conversation. Our preference is for you to use the raise hand function in Zoom, and you'll be queued, but you can also use the Q&A function. We have a question by an anonymous attendee. Actually, I had several questions by this attendee, I think. Did the Soviet Union and Turkey bilaterally discuss the rise of Nazi Germany and the role of the isolationist United States as affecting their respective countries? Also, the role of ideas was discussed. However, is it known that Stalin had territorial designs on Turkey? Also, how does the Soviet-Turkey relations compare to Soviet Iran, Soviet Afghan, Soviet nationalist China, and Soviet-Japanese relations? Those are a lot of questions. Pick and choose, Sam, to respond to this first set of questions. And in the meantime, our audience seems to be a little shy this afternoon, but please join the conversation. Sam, over to you.
So the question about any Soviet-Turkish conversations about the rise of Nazi Germany is an important one, and it gets at a bigger question, which I didn't have the time to speak about in my opening comments. But Eileen, you asked sort of what were the origins of this relationship, but there's another elephant in the room, which is when did the relationship end? Because ultimately Turkey ends in NATO. And for all the bilateral neutrality of the 1920s and the 1930s, that goes out the door with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. And as this anonymous attendee asks, with Soviet territorial designs on Turkey. And so on the question of how the rise of Nazi Germany was read in Moscow and Ankara in terms of the bilateral relationship, I would say that it was not read in a vacuum, because the other question that it was read alongside was also militarism in Italy. And essentially where the Soviet-Turkish partnership begins to fall apart is when you get different readings of what the dominant threat in Europe is. And for Turkey, it is unquestionably militarist Italy. For the Soviet Union, it's Nazi Germany. And what gives strength to the statist partnership that I describe in the 1920s and the early 1930s is it's clear that the West, that liberal internationalism, that the League of Nations and its sanctions, that is the threat. But by the middle of the 1930s, you get a different reading of what the threat is, and the Soviet-Turkish relationship begins to slowly unravel until the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, when you see a much clearer break. There are a lot of questions there, and I don't think I can do justice to them all, but perhaps I'll just say that one of the questions that I deal with in the book is that comparative angle. How does the Soviet-Turkish relationship compare to, say, the Soviet-Afghan, the Soviet-Chinese, or the Soviet-Iranian relationship? And Eileen, this comes back to another one of your questions, comments, which is that in other contexts, you see the domestic East being mobilized to communicate with the foreign East, as Masha Kirasira has described. And Turkey was an anomaly in that sense. And I think, and one of the things that I describe in the book, I don't really focus on that question, but in the book, I argue that the Soviet government was forced for various reasons to recognize sovereignty in Turkey in a way that it was reticent to do in Iran and in China. I remember when I was presenting an early version of this work, I was asked a question by someone in the audience, the late Norman Stone, and he asked, very provocative terms, this was characteristic for him. He said, why did the Bolsheviks get Turkey right and China wrong? And I try to answer that in the book, suggesting that the Soviets had much stronger investments in infrastructure in China, the Chinese Eastern Railway. The Soviets had much greater hopes for revolution in China, and they sought to use those old tools of imperial projection in ways in China that they didn't in Turkey. And so I think that the Soviet-Turkish relationship is unusual in the interwar period, in that you see the Soviet Union accept a position on semi-colonial, post-colonial sovereignty that was much more characteristic of the Soviet Union after 1945. After 1945, Soviet diplomats at the UN talk about state sovereignty ad nauseum. And what's unusual is that they come to that position in Turkey early in the interwar period.
Thank you. We have a question by Stephen Shore, who's raised his hand. Stephen, if you could unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Yes, you've not discussed religion in this period, and I understand that the Soviet state in this period was violently atheistic, and I'm wondering whether that model had any of the Kemalists consider this, or is that just too much for them to handle? And so whether there was any thought among the Kemalists that Islam was a cause of Turkey's backwardness.
So there are two questions there. One is whether the Soviet Union saw Islam as a cause of Turkish backwardness. And I think that in general terms, the answer would be yes. The Bolsheviks saw tradition, not only religion, but all kinds of traditional superstitions and so on as causes of backwardness. And there's plenty of evidence of Soviet diplomats and economists thinking about Turkish underdevelopment in those terms. But I alluded to this in my opening comments, and that is that despite, and the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists were clearly aware that there were similar processes going on in both countries. In Central Asia, various Soviet governments, and by various I allude to the fact that there were Central Asian Bolsheviks involved in this process, there was an attempt to change the way that Muslim women dressed. And this is at the same time that there's sartorial reform in Turkey. There were similar processes related to Islam, at least as a cultural form. And yet there's extreme discomfort about these similarities because the vision of social transformation was so different in the Soviet Union and Turkey. And so one of your questions was to what extent the Kemalists were perhaps interested in the anti-religious policies of the Soviet Union. And I would say that interest was very, very limited in the interwar period. And when in 1932-33, the interstate exchange related to industrialization really picks up, you get a sense of opening in Turkey to really questions about what the Soviet Union represented. And then it really is in terms of an economic, I'm trying to avoid using the word model, but an economic inspiration in terms of techniques and methods and organization. But you actually see in a lot of the Turkish press an attempt to downplay the sense that there was anything unusual about Soviet social and cultural reforms, the sense that Bolshevism was not as radical as it had been made out to be by a lot of the Western commentators. And so I think that there's quite a bit of discomfort in the question of social and cultural reforms.
Thank you. Roz Bagby, if you could please unmute yourself. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My question is perhaps too vague, although I'm sure you can at least sketch a bit. We've talked a lot about Stalin so far. Now, the first, in some ways, this is two questions. Did Lenin have any known policy differences in his approach to this arrangements with Turkey? And the other elephant in the room, did Trotsky have any known different intentions for Soviet, Turkish, Kemalist rather, interplay?
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I suppose, so Trotsky sort of departs from the picture by the late 1920s, Lenin even earlier. And so if we're talking about differences among the Soviet leadership in terms of the relationship with Turkey, this would be really a question about the first half of the 1920s. And in the first half of the 1920s, the biggest question was about whether one hoped for socialist revolution in Turkey, or one played the long game and made an alliance with the nationalist government, the Kemalists, against anti-imperialism and hoped that socialism would come some way down the road. And on that question, I think that Stalin and Lenin were more or less in agreement. If anything, Stalin was more skeptical about the relationship with Turkey. Trotsky comes into the picture a couple of times, but it's more about, the divisions among the Soviet leadership is more about the technicalities. There's a falling out when the Turks negotiate at Lausanne with the Western powers. How do you read Turkish reconciliation with the West? Is there going to be a line of anti-imperialism that continues in a post-war Turkish state? And there are minor divisions among Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky, but I would say on that bigger question of whether you hope for socialist revolution in the near and immediate future, or you hope for an anti-imperialist alliance with a national bourgeoisie, there's a relative consensus among the Soviet leadership on the idea that socialism in Turkey was something that was decades at least away.
Thank you. John Martin? John, please unmute yourself. There you go.
I wonder if the treatment of Armenians, the genocide against Armenians, which I gather was partly perpetrated by the Turks, played a role in what you uncovered in your book. Is it discussed at all?
Thank you. That's a question that also was asked by Tim Roberts in the Q&A. So over to you, Sam.
So I do discuss this a little bit in the book, and this comes back to one of the themes that Steffi pointed to. So in the book, I discussed the fact that the Soviet Union had developed relatively early what we would think of today, I think, as area studies specialists, people who devoted their lives to studying Turkey. And in the early 1920s, among some of the most prominent of these figures, I would point to someone like Vladimir Krukrazin as an example. You see a real discomfort with ethnic nationalism in Turkey. The Soviet Union, of course, offered a vision of multi-ethnic federation. And as it became increasingly clear that the Turkish state was going towards a vision of a quite narrow ethnic nation state, there were among some of the more prominent Turkey specialists, there was a real sense of discomfort and criticism of Turkish nationality policy. And this was tied to an analysis of the Armenian genocide and the way that fed into the politics of the Turkish Republic. But by about the mid-1920s, this criticism gets suppressed, and any concern for ethnic minorities or the rights of minorities in Turkey, in the Soviet Union, it gets sacrificed to a bilateral statist partnership. And one piece of evidence we have for that sense that this really was a sacrifice was that after the Second World War, when Turkey became a NATO member and became sort of clearly an enemy state, you get more attention in the Soviet Union, especially from Armenian figures, and calls to recognize the Armenian genocide. But that really is a story of post-1945.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're getting very close to the end of our session here. Let me just perhaps pose a final question. Sam, if we'd had this meeting in person at the Wilson Center, as we did for many years, and the session is over, you would have stepped into the elevator, ridden down to the ground floor. It turns out that in the elevator with you is a member of Congress or maybe a congressional staffer, and you would get asked to summarize in 30 seconds what is the relevance of your book for current global politics. Why should somebody in Congress read your book? What would be your take?
I think it matters which party the congressional number is coming from, right?
So should it? It matters.
So I think that sort of 30 seconds, I'm already losing time. If there are any lessons, right, then the Soviet-Turkish convergence of the 1920s and the 1930s really gained its strength in opposition to a liberal internationalist foil. And the peak of cooperation between the Soviet Union and Turkey came in the middle of the 1930s. And just as these massive factories are getting built, the relationship begins to fall apart. And in a sense, the opportunities were increasing in the mid-1930s. The Soviet Union had more ability to export industrial machinery. Turkey had more ability to import. But with the disappearance of the Western foil, the Soviet-Turkish relationship also fell apart. And so I think that recognizing the way that this kind of statism, this kind of internationalism cooperation drew its strength historically from the feeling of opposition gives us a sense of the possibilities today so I guess that's obvious why. So I'll stop there.
I think that's a thank you for that answer. We're at the end of our session. Let me remind everyone of next week's session, Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan. Richard Overy and other discussants will join us at 3 p.m., not 4 p.m. With that, I'm left to thank Sam, Eileen, and Steffi for really, really rich and wonderful and thoughtful and inspiring discussion. Sam, congratulations on the book. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.